Welcome back, everyone, for our continued conference on how to understand the housing crisis as we reflect in particular this afternoon on the issue of short-term leases, fixed-term leases, the housing crisis, tenant rights. And we're going to continue now with a panel. We're going to have a chance to hear from Joanne and Emma and Alec in a few more moments. So please take a moment to reconnect. So as we begin, we're going to have a chance to learn a little bit more about this issue with Joanne. And as we think about this issue, having had an opportunity to first begin with reframing of the whole issue with Dr. Levitan Reed from CDU, who kind of helped us contextualize this issue, and then Ray, who helped us see the role of intersectional bias and colonization and the ways in which historically marginalized and oppressed folks, especially those from the 2S LGBTQIA plus community, are disproportionately affected. So now, having had a little bit of lunch, we're going to look at specific problems and what can be done specifically around fixed term leases. And then we will end on a note of advocacy. How do we transform our learning into action? Again, all of this is because within the social work profession, we understand that the individual is impacted by larger organizational forces, and we advocate for the psychosocial, structural, and ecological factors that are part of community well-being and safety. And so this is a core issue. With that, we will begin.
Hi, I want to start by just thanking the Nova Scotia College of Social Workers for asking me to be here to talk to you today. And I certainly apologize for the canned presentation, and I'm sorry I'm going to miss what is sure to be a lively conversation with all of you about these important topics. So as I'm guessing you've already been told, my name is Joanne Hussey, and kind of in terms of understanding where I'm coming from in all of this, my thinking about housing is really informed by my work in a number of different contexts over quite a number of years. So back in 2013, I had the pleasure of working with Christine Saunier, the director of the Nova Scotia office of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, to evaluate the success of the Housing Support Worker Initiative when it was being piloted in Halifax. And then from 2016 through 2022, I worked in the Nova Scotia NDP caucus office as a research and policy officer, the deputy chief of staff, and then the chief of staff. And in those roles, I was definitely focused on what we were hearing from people in communities about the increasing struggle to find and keep affordable housing, as well as trying to develop the policy and legislative proposals that the NDP was putting forward as solutions to the growing crisis in housing, which we were seeing during that time. Then in 2022 and 2023, I had the privilege of covering Mark Culligan's parental leave at Dalhousie Legal Aid as a community legal worker. And in that role, I got to represent folks who were actually dealing with residential tenancies issues and represent them in their hearings. So I currently work for a union, but I've been around the world of housing and politics and social change for a while, which I suppose is the brief explanation of why I'm on this panel. And so although this ground has already likely been covered by others earlier in the day, I think it's really important when we talk about housing security and the right to housing that we do reflect on the fact that we're having these conversations in a context of settler colonialism. And in trying to address the legacy of occupation, the move towards the right to housing really does need to prioritize the needs of Indigenous and Black communities who have historically been displaced from their land and from their homes, and certainly have experienced the housing crisis in a way that is more intense than some other groups. So I'm going to start by talking about the history of rent control in Nova Scotia, which really helps to explain how fixed term leases became such a big problem for us here. So before 1993, Nova Scotia had a system of rent control that established an annual allowable increase to rents based on changes to the Consumer Price Index, or CPI, which is, we talk about in terms of inflation. So there was a limit to the amount your rent could increase depending on the general rate of inflation, and that applied to all units in Nova Scotia at that time. And landlords were able to apply for increases that were over the cap based on improvements that they could have made to the property or other factors, and then that would be determined by a commission whether or not those increases could go ahead. So that's the kind of permanent system of rent control that exists in other provinces. It exists across the country in many different places, and that advocates for rent control have been calling for a permanent system with a clear formula for determining what the increases can be, and an appeal mechanism for when there are reasons that a landlord may want to or be legitimately required to increase the rent or change the rent above that amount. So that was what was in place prior to 1993 in Nova Scotia. But unfortunately, in September of 1993, the Liberal government at the time used an order in council to remove rent control from residential properties in the province. So an order in council is just a way of referring to a decision that is made by cabinet in a closed meeting. And so there's no debate or no vote in the legislature. So there wasn't ever an opportunity for opposition parties at the time to show any opposition or to make any amendments to that change that removed rent control from Nova Scotia rentals. And oddly enough, the change that they made allowed the system of rent control to continue to apply to land lease communities or mobile home parks. So mobile home parks have remained under that system of CPI-related rent increases, and they still use that model right now. But from 1993 until 2020, there weren't any controls on rent increases in the province. So it was completely up to landlords to decide what the rent should be, how much they were going to charge, and how much it was going to change. In 2020, during the first year of the COVID pandemic, there were a number of reasons that contributed to the decision by the McNeil Liberals to put a 2% limit on increases to rent. So we saw a lot of properties changing hands. We saw a lot of people losing income. We saw a lot of investment from outside of the province. There were a lot of things that were contributing to really significant increases in rent that we hadn't seen on the same scale prior to that. The province at the time was under a state of emergency, and so again, the government used an executive order to put in place that 2% rent cap. One of the things that is interesting is that the November 25th, 2020 order that limited rent increases said that it would apply to the rental unit rather than to the individual tenant. But 2 days later, the government changed the order so that the rental increase protection would only apply to existing tenants in a unit. So that's really important, because that feature that allows rents to reset to any amount when a tenancy ends has been replicated in the rent control measures that have been put in place in Nova Scotia since then. And that's what really creates the situation we have now in terms of the surge in use of fixed term leases. So the rent control program that existed during the state of emergency was then rolled into a new piece of legislation called the Interim Residential Rental Increase Cap. That act was brought in 2021 and then amended in 2023, and both versions clearly link the rental increase cap to an existing tenancy. So what that means is that as long as a tenant remains in their unit, the rent cap applies. But as soon as that tenant no longer lives in that unit, the rent set for that unit can be changed to any amount and the rent cap no longer applies. So the result of that is that there is a very significant financial incentive for landlords to find ways to end tenancies of existing tenants so that they can reset the rent to any amount they want for the next person who moves in. This is fairly obvious, I think, and straightforward, that if by leaving someone in an apartment, it means that you can't increase the rent more than 2%. But if you can get someone else to move into that unit, you can increase it by $1,000. You could double it, you could triple it. You can see how this would create a lot of situations where people are being pushed out of their existing homes for a variety of reasons. There was a time when we were seeing an increase in the use of rent evictions as a way to move people out. The government did put in place some controls on rent evictions, which I think have had some success in reducing the number of rent evictions that have happened. What we haven't seen is anything to address the fixed term lease situation, which I think has become just more and more common, and in fact, the status quo for renters in Halifax for sure. So just that in terms of summarizing the current situation, which I think has been pretty consistent and worsening for the past 5 years, we have rents in Halifax that have grown significantly and have been in the top 20 highest in the country for the last number of years. We have a vacancy rate, which is the number of places that are actually available to rent, a vacancy rate of 1%, so very few available units. And in the United Way report, which I don't think is a surprise to anybody, that came out last week, Nova Scotia has the highest poverty rate in Canada and the second highest rate of food insecurity. And we know that there are more than 1,000 people in Halifax who are homeless at the present time, just in Halifax. And then on top of that, we have a rent control program in place that rewards landlords who can end the leases of existing tenants. And so it's no wonder that most leases that are offered to tenants now are fixed term leases, because a fixed term lease looks exactly like a standard lease. The only difference is that there is a different box checked partway through that indicates it's a fixed term lease. It has a fixed start date and a fixed end date, and your landlord is not required to give any reason for refusing to offer you a new lease. So it is entirely up to the landlord whether or not you can continue to live in the unit or not. And that is why we are seeing most leases being signed right now. They are fixed term leases. And there are a few really easy fixes here. First, the government could change the program of rent control so that the control or the rent cap actually applies to the unit and not to the specific tenancy. As I've mentioned, that's the system we had previously prior to 1993, and it's the system that exists in many other parts of the country. They could also bring back the system for landlords to apply for higher than allowable increases in situations where it is in fact justified. You know, if the landlord wants to put in a swimming pool, then they should be able to increase the rent, but it seems unlikely given how difficult it is to get most landlords to fix a toilet. The other option is to change the rules around fixed term leases. So in British Columbia, there are only specific circumstances where fixed term leases can be used. So for example, in BC, if you're renting out your primary residence while you temporarily work elsewhere, it would make sense for you to have a limit on the tenancy so that then you could move back in when you're ready. But we don't have any controls like that here. So you can use, a landlord can use a fixed term lease for all their tenants with no particular reason for using them. And that's the problem, is this blanket use of fixed term leases as a way to avoid the rent cap. But in order to make either of those two changes, we really need to see the sort of strong and continued public advocacy that got us rent control in its current form in the first place. So it's important to remember that organizations like ACORN and Dalhousie Legal Aid, as well as the Nova Scotia NDP, were advocating for rent control prior to the pandemic. And those efforts were met with really strong resistance from landlords, organizations like the Investment Property Owners of Nova Scotia, and members of the Liberal and Conservative parties. But that sustained advocacy for years prior that led to the rent cap during the state of emergency, and then the legislated cap that was put in place by a Liberal government that had insisted rent control did not work, and that has been maintained by a Conservative government that held the same view, was done because of the advocacy that was being done by folks either in the streets, by writing letters, by writing to their MLAs, by writing articles and op-eds that got us to the point where even the governments that did not support rent control as a policy choice or as a political choice, an ideological choice, had no choice. They knew they had to do it because the political cost, if not the economic and social cost, was too high if they didn't. So as I mentioned at the beginning of this little talk, I have been talking to people about housing in Halifax for more than 10 years, and public opinion has really changed dramatically. So in 2013, when the Housing Support Workers Initiative was being piloted, homelessness wasn't visible in Halifax the way it is today. And now when you talk to people, regardless of who you're talking to, they themselves or someone they know has a story about being evicted or having their rent increased by hundreds of dollars or being worried about where they'll go when they can't afford the place they live anymore. So I think I want to encourage you all to think about that as you go into your community mobilization and advocacy discussion later today, and to think about the fact that the government made the choice in November 25th, 2020, to put rent control in place. And 2 days later, they made the choice to weaken that protection. And there was a reason for that. And the reason for that was because they were obviously hearing from people that didn't want that to happen. I think back in 1993, when the rent control system was dismantled at that time, it had to be because they were hearing from people who wanted that to happen. And so we need to make sure that if we want to address the misuse of fixed term leases, the abuse of fixed term leases, we have to be telling the government, telling people who have the capacity to change the system that we need them to make those changes. So I hope that's helpful. I hope it helps set the stage for what some of the other folks are going to talk about. And thanks very much for letting me talk to you today.
Thank you so much, Joanne. We now are going to have a chance to hear from Emma from the Dalhousie Legal Clinic, and we'll get a chance to hear a little more from them.
Hello, everyone. My name is Emma McDonald, and I am a social worker in the role of housing support at the Dalhousie School of Social Work Community Clinic. For those that are not familiar with the clinic, we are located on Fenwick Street in the south end of Halifax. The clinic's purpose is to offer undergraduate and graduate students in the health professions an opportunity to learn frontline practice from a social justice and anti-oppressive perspective, to provide support and advocacy to the community, and to enhance existing frontline services by supporting their work and collaborating on complex cases. Our clinic has 5 social workers on staff and students from various professions. Currently, these include social work, psychology, occupational therapy, pharmacy, and therapeutic recreation. We work with clients who are primarily living in poverty or on a fixed income that they would not be able to access services otherwise. My role in housing support is a position funded by Department of Community Services. The role at the clinic is unique because I predominantly work with people that are facing housing precarity rather than people that are actively experiencing homelessness, as there are several organizations in the HRM that are serving this population. My work focuses on eviction prevention and keeping people safely housed. As we are amid a housing crisis, we have found that people often must choose to stay where they are despite challenges that they may face where they are currently living. For example, accessibility needs may be a factor, but finances are tight, public housing waitlists are long, so what can we do? In collaboration with our occupational therapy team, we can work together to see where modifications can be made in the client's home with safety at the forefront. Or certainly, people will do what they can to stay where they are as fixed-term leases are becoming more and more common. Today, I was invited by the college to speak to my experience with fixed-term leases and their impact on the health of our community. Today, I've chosen to discuss 2 case examples that are based off the experiences of clients that I've worked with, but please note identifiers have been changed to respect confidentiality. The reason in which I'm choosing to share these case examples is to shine light on the impact that fixed-term leases can have on people's physical and mental well-being. So the first example I would like to highlight is a client I worked with that is a senior that found herself suddenly on her own after the passing of her spouse. This resulted in a reduced income, and she could no longer afford the unit her and her spouse had shared. She found herself precariously housed because of the increasing housing cost, and the only rental she could afford had a fixed-term lease attached. But her choices were limited. It was either take the lower cost rental with the fixed-term lease, or live on the street, possibly a shelter, or in her car. Nearing the end of the fixed-term lease, her landlord chose not to renew, and she ended up in the same situation again, looking for a new apartment and facing homelessness. So I must ask, where is the stability in that? What other options did she have? I can remember her noting that when she moved into this unit, that she didn't even want to unpack her boxes or become comfortable, because what's the point on a fixed-term lease? This significantly impacted her mental health and still does, as she is presently a senior living in a shelter. What is clear is that there are structural issues she is up against, and this can be connected to so many older adults living on pensions. Even for this client, her pension was higher than clients we typically see, but she was still struggling with not only the loss of her spouse, but finding housing stability. I can also remember this client noting that they had done everything right in life. They went to school, they had a job, they paid into a pension, everything that society told them to do, but the system still failed them. And I think this really speaks to the narrative changing, whereby everyone is affected by housing, from all different walks of life, and ultimately this situation becomes exacerbated in many marginalized communities. Our second case I would like to highlight is when our clinic supported a client that had immigrated to Canada, and English is his second language. He had signed a fixed-term lease, but didn't realize exactly what that meant, which is a common occurrence we are seeing for people that are connected with our clinic. And now for this client in particular, he had been working diligently for years to have his family join him in Canada. They're now here, but their housing is in jeopardy because there's nowhere to go. He also noted that at the time of signing, his property manager told him that his lease would be renewed. But now that the end of the fixed term is approaching, he's being told that they are not renewing and his family must move. This conversation he had was verbal, and without written documentation that notes a renewal, he has no grounds to stand on. I've seen this time and time again when someone is being evicted and the only evidence that holds up in a hearing is written communication. But how are tenants supposed to know that? I've talked and worked with numerous clients that have been persuaded by landlords to rent based on a verbal agreement or offer that a lease will be renewed. So we can truly see that there is a power imbalance between landlords and tenants. I've heard from multiple clients that they feel they're being taken advantage of by landlords when they're in their most vulnerable positions. For example, in this case, he highlighted a language barrier. This family came to Canada for what they described as a better life, but now are faced with precarity in their housing due to landlords using fixed-term leases as a loophole to raise the rent. And this lack of stability has taken a significant impact on this family's mental health and well-being. So part of the challenging dynamics of doing my work is an influx of fixed-term leases. We've had people call the clinic that think they're being evicted, but when we explore this further with them, we realize they've signed a fixed-term lease and there are limited options at this point. I think this really speaks to how people do not always understand what they're signing, or they're in a precarious situation and must sign despite knowing there is an end date on tenancy. This calls into question, how am I supposed to do this preventative work when a fixed-term lease is a legal document and there are limited options? And even if a landlord chooses to renew tenants for another term, a new price sticker is attached that many people cannot afford. People are faced with crisis in systems that are already overworked and shelters that are at capacity. These case examples and discussions are just a few that we have encountered at the clinic. And as we are all aware, housing is a social determinant of health and a public health issue. And obviously being in constant fight or flight mode is going to take a toll on your body. There's literature to support that living outside is going to lead to health complications and earlier death. Certainly, there can be reasons that fixed-term leases can be used, for example, people seeking a short-term rental, but the problem lies with how fixed-term leases are being used. There needs to be rules and regulations in place to ensure that they are being used properly and ethically. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today regarding some of my experience pertaining to fixed-term leases. I hope from this discussion you can take some time to further reflect. Hello, everyone.
Thank you so very much, Emma, for sharing some of your reflections. We now are going to have a chance to hear from Alec, who probably requires no introduction, but as our executive director and registrar and fierce advocate, just grateful to have a chance to learn from you. Alec?
I'm grateful to be here today. I'm so happy that Naj was able to pull us all together and that we're able to talk about this really important issue. I'm going to really take some time to build off what both Joanne and Emma talked about to lead us into our advocacy efforts for this afternoon that we're going to talk about. Because the reality is that in order for this to change, it's going to take a collective effort for us to get this changed. I also want to talk about the fact that I'm here wearing two hats, as I often do. So I'm here as the Executive Director Registrar with the Nova Scotia College of Social Workers, but I'm also here as the chair of the Nova Scotia Action Coalition for Community Wellbeing, who's a group of organizations and individuals dedicated to eliminating poverty in Nova Scotia, which is crucial to our mandate as social workers, as well as to the care of vulnerable people, which is why I have the privilege to chair that. So I want to build off of what we've talked about and lead us into how we create change. We must uphold the dignity of every human being. It is time that housing, a fundamental human right declared so by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, is conceived not as a privilege, but as a guarantee for all. We need to be clear. Housing is more than bricks and mortar. It is health. It is security. It is the foundation upon which we build our families and our communities. We need to be, yet in the face of its profound importance, we find ourselves embroiled in what is a class struggle that has commodified our basic need for shelter. And it's important to note, I know that Catherine Leventon-Reed, as well as Ray, demonstrated that it is often those with intersecting identities, and those groups that are marginalized, that are often the most impacted by housing. But again, when we start to look at this through a class lens, we start to recognize that it is essentially a debate between those with power and those without, those who own property and those who rent. The narrative spun around housing policy attempts to paint a veneer of fairness, a facade of equality between landlord and tenant. But do not be misled. This is a distraction from the harsh truth. The scales of power are tipped unfairly in favor of those who own the foundations over those who dwell upon them. This imbalance is not incidental. It is the product of a system that perpetuates class conflict, where landlords command the terms of living, and tenants are left to navigate a precarious existence within the spaces that remain. Friends, what we've witnessed today is not the failing of individual landlords or bad actors. This is systemic exploitation, a byproduct of a market ideology that worships profits while trampling over human rights. We see homes transformed from havens into commodities, speculating inflating prices, and specter over homelessness haunting too many. We have to recognize that housing is a right. Profit is not a right. Today, I call your attention, as many have as well, to the pressing matter at the heart of our housing crisis, which is the lack of regulation, as Catherine alluded to this morning, in the private market. Yes, ultimately, the solutions involve far more substantial public, social, nonprofit, and cooperative housing, but it also requires regulation of our existing market, as both Joanne and Catherine and Emma have all pointed to. These instruments, rather than providing stability with the use of fixed-term leases, have become tools wielded by landlords to bypass protections such as rent caps, leading to unreasonable hikes in rents and unjust evictions. State of affairs in Nova Scotia is nothing short of a crisis. The interim control cap, which Joanne laid out for us earlier, was a ball against the economic unpredictability that we saw, and as Joanne also alluded to, has been circumvented through the cunningness of fixed-term lease agreements. The government has applied policy that has allowed landlords to exploit this loophole, have endangered the housing security of countless individuals. It's high time we demand policies that secure tenant rights, that close loopholes, and that put an end to predatory practices. We must fight for a Nova Scotia where access to decent housing is not a luxury, but a universal right. For in the world where the true measure of our progress, the genuine hallmark of a society that prides itself on compassion and justice, will be reflected in the health and happiness of every citizen, housed, secured, and dignified, not the exponential growth of our markets or our GDP. We stand at a critical juncture in the disclosure of Nova Scotia housing policy, where the echoes of political debate reverberate through the chambers of our collective consciousness. The reality we face today is one of stark inequality, a fight where the fundamental rights of tenants are pitted against landlords' profit interest. There's an undeniable bias skew in favor of property owners, leaving our renters exposed to the whims of market forces and the instability it breeds. We have to dismantle the illusion of balance within the class struggle. To speak of balance is to imply an equality that does not exist between tenant and landlords. Tenants seek shelter, a basic human right, and which is essential for their very existence, while landlords seek to maximize profits for their property investments. There should be no contest here. Human rights must always triumph over profit. The exploitation of fixed-term leases to evade rent control impacts the accessibility of affordable housing, as both Emma and Joanne have pointed out. And the duty of our government has to be to guarantee secure living conditions for every income bracket as a right. Housing justice demands more stringent regulations and the strict enforcement of laws that prevent this blatant manipulation by landlords at the expense of the vulnerable tenants. Historically, the struggle for those who own and those who labor has propelled societal transformation. It's important to recognize that where we've seen advancements in our progress has been that continued class struggle. The Residential Tenancy Act should not be a tool for perpetuating the advantage of privilege, but a means to protect and empower those in need. Both our ministers, Colton LeBlanc of Service Nova Scotia and Lohr, whenever they're talking about housing policy, talk about the balance between tenant and landlord's interest. As stated, there is no balance here. Landlords have the power, tenants do not. It's government's obligation to ensure that tenants have the power to live a safe, dignified life. Full stop. Again, when they are talking about balance, they are themselves engaging in a class struggle, and they are engaging in advancing the interests of those of the powerful. To speak of an equilibrium between the inherently unequal is folly. Landlords hold the key, not just to properties, but to power, setting the terms that tenants accept. This disparity is magnified during housing crisis, where the scarcity of options leave tenants even more disadvantaged. Human dignity is not negotiable. This is upheld in international human rights law, recognizing the right to adequate housing as a fundamental right. Yet our policymakers, faced with the clear directive to safeguard this right, often fall short again and again. Joanne gave us a striking example of that, where the government did the right thing and then walked it back. It's important to remember in this struggle that, again, in order to create the type of social change that we want, and Joanne gave us an example as well, we won rent control. We won rent control because there were countless people and organizations involved in advocating for that, continuing to raise political and public discourse, continuing to meet with MLAs, and making it, again, an impossibility that rent control is not going to be a politically viable solution moving forward. It's important to know, of course, that progress is never a straight path. It often comes with curves and delineates now and then. But what is most important is that we continue to persist towards the type of change that we need to see. Direct action is essential to correct these power imbalances. More rhetoric of balance only serves to uphold a flawed status quo. Our government must enshrine in laws the protection that prioritize the right to housing over the profits of landlords. Until substantial regulations are put in place to shield tenants from predatory practice, like unjust rent hikes, evictions, the scales remain tipped and our work remains undone. My friends, the impact of government choosing the status quo has been a disaster, as was laid out by Emma. Thousands in our province wake up every day without a place to call home. They are not just figures on a report. They are our neighbors, our friends, our families. They live not in the security of a home, but in the uncertainty of shelters, the transience of couch surfing, or beneath the open sky. Their dwellings, often hazardous and always precarious, push them to the margins of society. And there are those among us who struggle daily because their homes are not built to accommodate their needs. So there is a call to action here, folks, and we're going to talk about these over the course of the rest of the conference here. Housing, often a word too sterile for the concept it represents, is the embodiment of health, of dignity, and of life itself. It is the cradle of well-being, the sanctuary for the soul. Therefore, let it be clear, there is no health without housing. Our premier has pledged to fix healthcare, but we all urge him to recognize that true healing begins with the provision of a stable home. The anxiety bred by housing anxiety erodes our physical, mental health, as well as our social fabric. To mend these tears, housing must become the cornerstone of our healthcare reform. Our government's strategies are rooted in a flawed belief that public subsidies to private development will solve this issue, as Catherine laid out this morning, and has only served to deepen the chasm. The hour for decisive action is now. It's time that we demand change to seek justice. It's time to insist that our government places the well-being of people above the profits of those who own property. So I know it's been put into the chat a number of times. I'm going to put it in again. There's an active campaign right now by the Nova Scotia Action Coalition that encourages all of us to take a number of steps. First of all, we've heard a number of the solutions today that need to be done. We must enact law that ensures fixed-term leases are limited, or if they are in place, transition from month-to-month agreements. This simple shift would ensure that tenants' rights to stability are automatically protected rather than being left vulnerable to exploitation. Rent increases need to be applied to the unit, not the tenant, as was said this morning. Illegitimate evictions must carry the weight of legal penalties, and evictions hearings must be made compulsory regardless of the circumstances surrounding non-payment. This ensures that even those facing financial struggle are able to have a fair opportunity to present their case. We must scrub clean the standard form leases from erroneous terms that unfairly burden tenants, that are unclear and that confuse people, and tear down some of those socioeconomic barriers promoting greater equity. We must regulate and cap additional fees imposed by landlords. The tenants are not penalized beyond their needs, and we need to eliminate discriminatory housing policies the intrusive demands for personal information currently used to filter potential renters out, and that must be stopped. Importantly, we must organize our power. Where we've seen tenant unions in Canada form, they've been quite successful, as in every class struggle, in standing up to the powerful. And so we must create legislation to allow tenant unions to be able to form, to be able to fight back against landlords and tenants, or to fight against landlords. And I want to also mention, and this is why the Nova Scotia Action Coalition chose this particular area to dive into action, is that the housing crisis no doubt requires immense investments. Again, we need a vast amount of cooperative, social and nonprofit housing. What these changes that we've just laid out, they cost the government, us, nothing. These are regulations to better control the current market that we currently have. There is no cost. This are as simple as cabinet passing an order and changing the font in our current legislation to be able to empower folks to do this better. So I call on all of you today to join us in forging a future where all Nova Scotians have a home, where dignity is not just an ideal, but a lived experience, and where the health of our community is anchored in the strength of our resolve. Let it be said that in Nova Scotia, a home for all is not just a lofty dream, it is a goal within our grasp, a mission we can accomplish together. Protecting the rights of tenants and implementing changes to ensure fair housing is a matter that transcends mere legal adjustments. It is, at its core, an act of recognizing and addressing the inherent imbalance of power between tenant and landlord, a struggle that is not new. It echoes throughout time for the rights of the working class. The pursuit of fair housing policies represents our modern day battleground to secure equity and justice for all members of society, regardless of their class. The intricate relationship between housing and health is inconvertible. The consequences of unstable, unsafe, and unaffordable housing ripple through our communities, resulting in increased stress, higher rates of illness, and greater mortality. Housing insecurity is not just an economic issue. It's a public health issue that leads to social exclusion and compounds the disparities currently existing within our healthcare system. So I urge all of you to go today to the housingishealth.com platform and take the actions that are signed up there, that are there. To sign the declaration of support. Again, the more signatures there, the more we can show our collective power. We're going to talk more about this afternoon, but we have an advocacy toolkit. And what we need folks to do is to reach out to their MLAs, either through email or setting up a meeting and talking to them directly about why this is important and why these shifts need to be changed. Again, we see the power of landlords in advocating for their interests. We have to do the same. And we need to be able to meet and recognize that MLAs work for us, not the other way around. And that our power collectively will ensure that these changes can be made. And finally, there are a number of messages, memes that you can share on your Facebook page. We have to be able to sustain a public discourse on why these changes are necessary. Now, let me be clear. Engaging with this campaign is not a passive gesture. It's an active commitment to the immediate needs of those without a home and a pledge to strive for systemic change. We must recognize and respond to the truth that housing is more than a commodity, it is a cornerstone of health, a vital component of our collective well-being. Join me, my friends, as we champion this cause. Together, let us build a future where every individual has access to the safety and security of a stable home. And let our actions today pave the way for a healthier, more equitable society tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. So we have questions and comments coming in. One of the many, many comments that was in the chat is, in addition to colonization, racism, intersectional bias, just a reminder of the ways in which this puts people at risk in terms of intimate partner violence and family violence and human trafficking as a result of this. There are a few comments in the chat as well, but here in the Q&A, reminder that we're taking questions through the Q&A. So we've got both the Liberals and the NDP proposed a solution to end fixed term leases, but the PCs turned it down in the fall legislature. How can people get involved to change this? So I don't know if you have any thoughts. I know we're going to be talking in a little bit about advocacy, and we put a link to how to contact your MLA and also how to join the Nova Scotia coalition. If you have any other comments, Alec, or shall we save that for the next?
Yeah, we are going to talk about how we create that change later this afternoon using our toolkit and what that looks like. I can say right now that when meeting with MLAs with writing letters, it's important to remind them of their mandate, which is, again, to fix healthcare, which housing is intricately connected. To remind them again that we're talking about the collective well-being and interests of our society, not a few elite folks, and ultimately to remind them of the power behind this movement. Now, at one point in time, we had 200 people signed up for this session. There were 350, I believe, registered. And so, again, we can show that there is many people impacted here, and that these policy decisions and choices and movements that we're putting forward are not just, again, some disenfranchised group of fighting for rights. These are popular ideas that are going to need to be enshrined in their own worldview and legislation should they seek re-election.
Thank you so much. There was also, it was mentioned in the Q&A that if anyone wants to help lobby the government to get rid of fixed term leases, February 17th at 11:30 at Chocolate Lake Community Center is an opportunity to do so as well. And then there's a question: is there an estimate of how many Nova Scotians will end up unhoused? It's the tip of the iceberg in terms of how many are already in this situation, but do we have a sense if no action happens, what will happen?
I don't know that we have seen data on that. Catherine, I don't know if Catherine is still here, but Catherine would probably be in a better position. Catherine, do you have any insight into what we're facing if we don't act? And you've seen any comment on that?
Well, I can certainly say that well, there's no data on how many Nova Scotians have fixed term leases. That's not available. So that's why it's really important for folks like, I mean, folks at Dal Legal Aid already know this, but anyone working with tenants, any tenants organizations need to be tracking how many people who are coming to them who are reporting they have fixed term leases. We have, I can't tell you off the top of my head, you know, unfortunately, with the core housing need data that we have, that's from the census, and that underestimates the number of people who are housing insecure because it draws on the income supports people were receiving during the pandemic. So unfortunately, no, I cannot tell you how many people are at risk of losing their housing this year.
Simply that we know it's growing, and we know that there are populations that are being affected that we're not used to seeing affected, such as seniors, you know, families in particular. I know somebody put in the chat there the impact of housing and intimate partner violence. You know, we know recently Bronte House just had to change its policy to say that families can only stay there for, I think it's 3 months at this point in time. That is forcing folks, and again, I understand Bronte's decision. They're not meant to be a long-term housing solution. They're meant to be a temporary shelter. Again, what that is doing is pushing folks often back into violent relationships because there's no access to housing where they can live safely. It is a vicious cycle that is really serving a few people, and it's serving them quite well in terms of how much money they're able to exploit out of this situation. It is not a healthy situation for most Nova Scotians, and the reality is that that can be changed. again, and we need to remind folks that that change must come.
So in terms of the questions, a lot of obviously strong reactions and feelings in terms of what we're seeing and how it's doing that. But here's, where do lenders, realtors talk around the elimination of GST, HST on construction items fall in all of this? Is one of the questions that we have.
Yeah, again, my understanding is that that was a push that was named by many of the groups that Catherine and Joanne mentioned in their presentations that represent developers and landlords. I believe that it is a policy that generally benefits landlords and developers more than it benefits the creation of housing. You have to remember, as Catherine laid out, that our route out of this is the creation of more social housing. In order to produce more social housing, the province needs to collect the revenues in order to afford and pay for that. So again, my opinion is that removing GST and HST diminishes our capacity to build the public and social housing that we need.
Thank you. So there's also a question about how do we hold the government accountable for, if this seems like negligence in terms of the loopholes that exist and the way it's currently happening.
Yeah, there's two ways to hold governments accountable. One would be through the courts. I'm not a lawyer, so I wouldn't be able to comment on exactly what that pathway looks like. But ultimately, again, the courts have done a good job of particularly, maybe I shouldn't say good job. The courts have done a job at where needed, holding government accountable to violations of human rights. You know, I've seen that recently in Nova Scotia with the case and Disability Rights Coalition, in which again, human rights law ruled that the province had violated them. We saw that again in the provision of services to Indigenous kids on reserve with the lack of funding to both child welfare and education that Cindy Blackstock brought forward. The second way to hold government accountable, which is the way that we're talking about now, is through direct action, the raising of political and public discourse, and ultimately organization to either elect people who do represent these views and can make these decisions, or to continue to hold those who we have elected to account for the political and policy decisions that they are making.
There's a question around how there was a landlord registration last year, but no evidence of how it's going. How can people find out?
Yeah, so that was an initiative that Acorn really championed and brought forward at the municipal level. I don't know what the progress is at this point in time in terms of how effective it's been or where it's going. Again, its intent is to do what we're talking about here too, which is to greater regulate together regulate the private market, and it is an effort to do that. Again, we need a number of policies to be able to do that, and certainly landlord registration would be an important one.
Thank you. Definitely a lot of good conversation in our chat around our Human Rights Commission that's a year behind in triaging human rights violations. So just the ways in which the understaffing and under-resourcing of certain areas of government is impacting us. When we are thinking about this issue, and we're going to have a chance to talk more around advocacy and community mobilization in a few moments, can you summarize once again why, of all of the issues that we need to think about, you would suggest, or how the Community Action Coalition would suggest that we focus on specifically fixed term leases as our first stepping on this issue?
Yeah, I think it's for two reasons. One, you know, we heard Emma and Joanne lay out the impact that fixed term leases are having. It's pretty robust. Second, we really see it as low-hanging fruit in terms of change that can be made. We know that the investments into social and public housing are closer to around $10 billion, which is going to take time to mobilize and be able to push for that substantial of a change in how our financial policy works. In terms of the types of changes we're talking about, as I mentioned, it really is, we heard Joanne talk about how governments have done it with an order in council, right? They sat around the cabinet table, made a motion, not debated, and changed the ink on the paper. The type of changes that we're talking about here are as simple as that. And so we really see it as low-hanging fruit, something that can be done without a huge influx of new financial capital, which is needed 100%, but it seems like an easier fight.
Thank you. And there's some comments as well around the role of the Indian Act and colonization and the ways in which there's so few options for people to advocate for change. Lots more comments around this, but one of the things that we discussed, just to reiterate, is the idea that with the fixed term leases, if we were to get rid of those, the goal would be to advocate for that to be true for all existing leases. Is that correct?
Sorry, I was reading some of the chat there.
I know there's a lot of very interesting things. So the question was around, when we get rid of fixed term leases, we want to get rid of it for everyone, not just new leases, but people who are facing this precariously. One decision could impact a ton of people in terms of the precariousness with which they're living.
That's right. It can. The evidence seems to show that. I mean, Emma laid out 2 case examples where it had a substantial, where fixed term leases were having a substantial impact on the quality of a service user's life. And so again, we do want this to be not just a temporary change. The Premier's rhetoric around that the housing issue is solely rooted in a supply issue is a false one. What the Premier is stating when he makes a claim like that is that the claim that many conservative politicians make, which is that if we stack resources and profit at the top, that will trickle down to benefit the rest of us. Trickle down, we know it doesn't trickle down. There's too many sponges at the top, soaking up all of the benefits that are there. And so, changes to the fixed term leases is about changing the power, taking and applying more of it to tenants in this situation.
Thank you so very much. We are going to have a chance to continue with our conference with community mobilization and advocacy. There's a link to our advocacy toolkit that was done in partnership with the Legal Information Society of Nova Scotia that outlines the difference between federal, municipal, and provincial, because we know that this is sort of split and siloed a little bit, but we did have a chance to begin thinking about some concrete steps that could make an impact quickly. Any closing thoughts for us, Alec, before we take a brief break?
Yeah, again, there is no action that is too small towards this, and we're going to talk more about advocacy this afternoon. But we have to remember again that we elect people to serve us, not the other way around. And so it's really important that we work to engage and we work to hold accountable. The very powerful have been able to do that very well. Our power is, again, groups this size acting together. So I hope, again, we can build some confidence towards that by the end of the day.
Thank you. Lots more wonderful conversation in the chat. And a question about the estimate around a cost to build social housing and what that would look like. I don't know if you have that off the top of your head. If not, we may need to have that continue through the chat.
I'll turn that over to Catherine. I know our estimates are a few years old now.
Yeah,
But yeah,
they are, Alex. So we costed that out when we prepared the Housing for All report during the pandemic. So that's at least 2 years old. You know, it's all a blur. I'd have to go back. And that was for just over 33,000 non-market units. So I don't have that at my fingertips, but during the break, I'm just going to go find that report, and I'll put the link in the chat.
that would be great. If I recall, and Catherine's going to get the exact data, but I believe that the estimate, and I know Christine's online too, so she might be able to put it in the chat. But I believe what we said is that we needed an investment of about $500 million each year for the next 10 years to build those 33,000 units.
And you know, the reality is that we have the funds to pay for that money. So everyone on this call knows about the cost of homelessness. I see it all around me, you know, the emergency services that respond to folks who are experiencing homelessness is just one example of that. So absolutely, it's an upstream investment, right?
That's right.
Thank you very much. And thank you for reminding us around when we talk about cost to things that we're talking about not only cost of the, we're not only talking about the cost of the building of the houses, but the costs we're already paying because of the ways it's being mismanaged currently. So it's a question of redirecting funds, but lots more is going on in the chat, and then resources are going to, but we're going to take a brief break. Alec, thank you so very, very much. We are so grateful to you and to our panelists for helping us understand the issue of fixed term leases. And with that, we are going to take a small break, and we will be back at 2:15 for our closing panel. Thank you, everyone.